Chapter 4, Brother I'm Dying, by Edwige Dantacat. Heartstrings, Shoestrings. My father quit school in 1954 at age 19 to start an apprenticeship with a neighborhood tailor. Not just any ordinary tailor, but a man whose small at-home workshop turned out hundreds of unisex children's shirts made with the cheapest cloth, thread, and labor, apprentices available. My father was expected to sew 24 little shirts each day. The shirts were then sold to vendors who resold them all over Haiti. Papa's share of the profit was about 5 pennies per shirt. He quit after 6 months once he'd saved and borrowed enough money to buy his own sewing machine. He then began working for himself, selling directly to the vendors. That is, until the 1960s, when used clothes from the United States, which were called Kennedy's, because they were sent to Haiti during the Kennedy administration, became readily available. One afternoon, my father was looking for another job when he stopped by the fabric shop where my Uncle Joseph worked. He'd become a regular customer there and was on good terms with the boss, who told him about an Italian emigre who had just opened a shoe store on Grand Rue and was looking for a salesman. My father ran over to the store and, on the recommendation of my uncle's boss, was hired on the spot. My father's new boss was always covered in jewelry. In addition to a gold necklace as thick as this belt, he wore an equally fat bracelet and two large gold rings on each hand. If men wore earrings back then, my father used to say, he'd have worn 4. But the boss's personal extravagance belied what he would pay my father. His salary was modest, less than the equivalent of $20 a month, with the possibility of a commission on sales of more than 3 pairs of shoes. Having worked non-stop both as an apprentice and for himself, my father thought that his new job would be a breeze. All he had to do was talk people into buying something they needed anyway. The store carried shoes in many styles and price ranges: men's shoes, women's shoes, rubber shoes, plastic shoes, and the most expensive of all, leather shoes. He was told to emphasize that all of the shoes, like the owner of the shop, were from Italy. Otherwise, you can get any street corner cordonnier to make you a pair of shoes, the boss encouraged him to tell the customers. But of course, very few of the shoes were actually from Italy. The rest, he discovered, came from the United States via Puerto Rico. Every once in a while, my uncle would recommend to his growing congregation that they buy their shoes from my father. Papa, in turn, convinced his boss to offer special discounts to my uncle's parishioners by reminding him that church people were less likely to use birth control, which meant many more potential customers. That period in my father's life, the early 60s, was also shadowed by much larger events. Papa Doc Duvalier, who followed Daniel Fignol into the presidential palace, refused to step down or allow new elections, despite a growing dissatisfaction with his increasingly repressive methods of imprisoning and publicly executing his enemies. Instead, he had created a countrywide militia called the Tonton Macoute, a battalion of brutal men and women aggressively recruited from the country's urban and rural poor. Upon joining the Macoute, the recruits received an identification card which showed their allegiance to Papa Doc Duvalier, an indigo denim uniform, a .38, and the privilege to do whatever they wanted. My father recalled how some Macoutes would walk into the shoe store, ask for the best shoes, and simply grab them and walk away. He couldn't protest or run after them, or he might risk being shot. After losing too many shoes, his boss came up with a solution. He ordered a large number of third-rate, non-leather shoes that looked like the real thing. Most of the Macoutes who walked in wanting to steal shoes either didn't care or couldn't tell the difference anyway. If they asked to try on a pair of shoes, my father was to let them try on only the $3 shoes. Papa would always get a knot in his stomach when a Macoute asked him if there were other shoes. He would try not to shake as he replied, "No," all the while bending and massaging the cheap shoes to make them appear more supple. In the end, it was this experience of bending shoes all day and worrying about being shot that started him thinking about leaving Haiti. My parents tell slightly differently the story of how they met in 1962, when they were both 27 years old. In my mother's version, They met in a Bel Air grocery store owned by one of my mother's older sisters, where she often went to help out. Back then my mother was slender, beautiful, in a brooding, melancholy kind of way, and painfully shy. One day my father walked into the tiny, dimly lit shop, where my mother greeted him with a smile at the door. A few days later, she just happened to visit the shoe store on Grand Rue to buy a new pair of shoes. He helped her try on a few women's shoes, none of which fit. She thanked him and left the store. My father has no recollection of the first meeting at the grocery store. He simply remembers her walking into the shoe store, too shy to even look up from her dusty old sandals. He wanted to keep her in the store as long as possible, so he gave her shoes to try on that he knew wouldn't fit her. Finally, when, frustrated, she walked out of the store, he followed her home. They were married 3 years later. Before my mother came along, Uncle Joseph wanted my father to marry Tante Denise's sister Léon, who, though she was 5 years younger than Tante Denise, looked like her twin. They were nearly identical, except Léon dressed more casually than Tante Denise, for whom being the pastor's wife meant never leaving the house without her matching hat and gloves and one of her many shoulder-length wigs, which she preferred to her own shortly cropped hair. The fact that Tante Denise made her own clothes and could buy cloth at a discount from my uncle's fabric shop made it easy for her to maintain her consistently elegant attire. Léon lacked the means and interest, and thus always looked like the twin who, though just as pretty, had been abandoned at birth. Though Léon loved my father, he wasn't interested in her. Besides, as he told me one night during that visit after his diagnosis, when he happened to stumble on the bride capture musical 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, which he thought was about 7 brothers marrying 7 sisters, it's not as if your uncle and I were Cain and Abel and there was no one else in the world to marry. After my parents married, they moved into a small house in an increasingly packed section of Bel Air. The cement floor of their 2-room rental was the same drab color as the walls. There were no windows or jalousies, just some diamond-shaped openings in the concrete which let in some air and also plenty of water when it rained. My mother decorated the best she could, draping the walls with wide ruffled curtains she made herself. They wanted to have children right away, but couldn't conceive, prompting my uncle and Tante Denise to constantly request prayers for them at church. My parents were about to celebrate their 4th wedding anniversary when I was born in 1969. 20 months later, Bob followed. After Bob and I were born, my father started sewing again when he came home from the shoe store. My mother joined him in making school uniforms and tiny flags for school children to wave on Flag Day. One afternoon before closing the shoe store, my father was talking to his boss about the boss's son, who was soon leaving for vacation in New York. "You think I can get a visa?" my father asked. Then as now, leaving often seemed like the only answer, especially if one was sick, like my uncle, and poor, like my father, or desperate, like both. My father's boss offered to write him a letter of support for his application. Because he had a job, a wife, and 2 children as incentives to return to Haiti, my father was granted a 1-month tourist visa, but he had no intention of coming back. I had no memory of my father's departure or of anything that preceded it. Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise's adopted daughter, Marie Micheline, liked to tell me how the year before my father left, he would often buy a small pack of butter cookies on his way home from work in the evening, which he intended to give to me. I didn't like the cookies, but my face would light up when I saw them, and I'd laugh, and he'd give me one, and I'd return it to him, only to hoot even more when he popped it in his mouth. I've since discovered that children who spend their childhood without their parents love to hear stories like this, which they can embellish and expand as they wish. These types of anecdotes momentarily put our minds at ease, assuring us that we were indeed loved by the parent who left. Unfortunately, I wasn't told many stories like that. What I did often hear was about was the future, an undetermined time when my father would send for my mother, Bob, and me. Once my father was gone, Uncle Joseph would stop by every now and then to see us after work, and of course my mother Bob and I continued to attend services at his church. Fiercely independent and too proud to seek his involvement or ask for loans when the monthly allowance my father sent her ran out, my mother continued my father's work sewing school uniforms and flags. One Sunday morning, when she had no money at all, my father dropped us at on my uncle's lap after church so we could have a proper Sunday meal with him and Tante Denise. One day this will stop, my mother told him. Then she ran home crying. 2 years after my father left, when I was 4 and Bob was 2, the 1-month tourist visa that my mother had applied and been rejected for several times was finally approved. When it came time for her to leave, we drove with her, Tante Denise, Uncle Joseph, Bob, and me, to the airport. Bob sat on my mother's lap in the back seat, and I sat next to her with my head leaning against her arm. In the airport at the gate, my mother's eyes welled with tears as she handed Bob over to Tante Denise, who quickly removed her gloves and received him in her arms. Back then, Tante Denise rarely removed her gloves in public, so the very careful gesture, her removing her gloves and patting her wig slightly with her well-manicured fingers, seemed to me to indicate that something big was going to happen. I didn't know exactly when the word had come that my mother could leave, but I should have suspected something. All that week my mother had been sewing me dresses, long ones with large bows and elaborate collars, short ones in carnation prints, and others with pink lace ruffles. By the end of the week I had 10 dresses in total, most of them too big for me, so that I realized now I could wear them in the future while she was gone. She had even made me a matching version of the plain white dress that we were both wearing at the airport, a dress that resembled the kind of modest frock one might wear to be immersed in water at an adult baptism at my Uncle Joseph's church. It was all making sense. She had also bought Bob 3 brand new suits, 2 of them with short pants and 1 large one with long pants. She had given away the light blue unopened sheet set she kept under her bed for a sick day to Marie Micheline, and her ceramic pictures to Tante Denise. But she hadn't moved our things from our house, our beds, our clothes, and a treasured birthday gift from my uncle, a copy of Ludwig Bemelmann's Madeleine. These things, were they even now being moved to Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise's house? When it was time for my mother to board the plane, I wrapped my arms around her stocking legs to keep her feet from moving. She leaned down and unballed my fists as Uncle Joseph tugged at the back of my dress, grabbing both my hands, peeling me off of her. "Calm," he said. "Calm yourself." And for a moment his voice, deep, firm, did pacify me. After all, it seemed that he and Tante Denise would now be in charge of us. They would be our parents. But what if our mother went away and never came back, just like our father? Panic, I leaped out of Uncle Joseph's arms and ran right to my mother, pressing my face against her legs. I pushed him back as he tried to grab me again. Having run from Tante Denise, Bob was also on the floor, pounding his tiny fists against the cold tiles, bawling. His face was covered with some phlegm he had spit up. Answering a final boarding call, my mother hurried away, her tear-soaked face buried in her hands. She couldn't bear to look back.